Hello and welcome to Views on News. I am Jawad Tehami. The Gaza's health ministry says that Israel has killed over 32,000 innocent people in Gaza in almost 6 months of its brutal aggression against the innocent people in Gaza since 7th of October. At the same time, the United Nations Satellite Center says the new satellite images reveal that 36% of the buildings in Gaza have been destroyed since 7th of October. There is a group of aid agencies that say that an estimated 70% of the population in northern Gaza faces catastrophic hunger. Also, we have seen EU's top diplomat has blamed Israel for the crisis, saying an impending famine in Gaza was entirely man-made. Pakistan's Foreign Office has urged the United Nations Security Council to impose a ceasefire and lift the inhumane siege. Meanwhile, we've also seen United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who is on his 6th visit to the Middle East since 7th of October, has said, let me quote him, "We actually have a resolution that we put forward right now that's before the United Nations Security Council that does call for an immediate ceasefire tied to the release of hostages," unquote. Since Israel launched this brutal aggression on the besieged Gaza enclave, the US has already vetoed 3 times such resolutions at the United Nations Security Council, which demanded for an immediate ceasefire. On the other hand, we have seen Palestinian Foreign Ministry saying, let me quote it, "We appreciate Blinken's efforts, but we do not see tangible results from his tours," unquote. Also, according to White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, President Biden and Netanyahu held a phone call, their first in 31 days. Jake Sullivan says, let me quote him, "The US felt a major ground operation in Rafah would be a mistake, and Mr. Biden warned Netanyahu against it," unquote. On the other hand, we have seen Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has once again vowed to press ahead with his assault on the southern city of Rafah in Gaza. All these important developments are for discussion in today's show. For that, we are honored to have been joined in the studio by Mr. Jauhar Saleem, his former Foreign Secretary of Pakistan. Ambassador Saleem, thank you very much for your time, for being with us on the show tonight. We really appreciate that. Also, on Skype, we are honored to have been joined by Dr. Hamid AlMashriqi, the analyst and strategic affairs expert. Dr. AlMashriqi, thank you very much for your time also for being with us on the show tonight. We really appreciate that. Let me begin with you, Mr. Saleem. Now, let's take a stock of the overall situation that is, of course, dire for the innocent people in Gaza ever since Israel launched this brutal offensive. Now, what the United Nations Satellite Center says, that 36% of Gaza's buildings have been destroyed. That amounts to be around over 88,000 structures. Quite a phenomenal number, a mind-blowing number. So what does that actually speak about this particular offensive and the reign of terror that has been unleashed by Israel?
Yeah, it's very, very unfortunate, as we know. But this is something that was envisaged. I think I was one of those who had said at the very inception of this offensive that it would lead to what could be termed as a massacre and a humanitarian catastrophe of epic proportions. And that, unfortunately, is what is unfolding. And it is sad that so many endeavors have failed thus far, and by so many different countries and all the voices in the world. And we saw the huge demonstrations that took place in many Western capitals as well. The public opinion is there. We know that in many, many countries, this has actually triggered some tensions between different ethnicities, including European countries, including the US as well. In fact, in the US, we see that it has sparked tensions between the Democrats and Republicans. Both the parties support Israelis unequivocally, but what is unfolding in Gaza, the death toll, which has gone over 32,000 and more than 70,000 injured, and as you said, over 30% of the buildings demolished there, and the starvation and the lack of basic human amenities, and what is happening with the women and children there, the way children are dying, the way unfortunately the pregnant women are starving as well, and one can just shudder at the thought of what will happen to the children that they will give birth to. So this is for the world to see, and the international public opinion is very clear on that. But at the same time, we know that within Israel, the feeling for sustained action, in fact, that has not faltered so far. In fact, like other than Netanyahu, the leading opposition parties, they are even sometimes more extremist in their views. They have been talking about displacing all the Palestinians from Gaza. We even see similar voices now. Jared Kushner, for example, in the US, Trump's son-in-law, and an advisor who, again, if Trump is elected again, will have a very important role in his administration if he becomes president. He's come up with a statement saying that if the Palestinians are, if they have to be displaced, probably he meant temporarily, but even that is, like displacing 1.4 million people from their homes, and where will they go? So I think there's no let off, but at the same time, like I have said previously, the only hope that I saw, and events have proved it right, was the negotiations, the shuttle diplomacy being conducted by the Americans, which involved countries such as Egypt and Qatar and of course the Israelis. Now that negotiation, there have been times where cautious optimism has been expressed, but then there has been setback. I think the basic question is about the hostages, because the Israelis want the release of all the hostages, and I think the deal as as it is sort of unraveling in public view, whatever part of it, we see it is about the offer is about a 6 weeks ceasefire and release of all the hostages for that, and sort of with certain conditionalities. Now we see a point where the sort of some quarters have expressed optimism. The Israelis have been so far sort of very, very inflexible on that. And I think this is part of their strategy, and they have expressed pessimism about the over the results of this negotiation. But the U.S. for the first time in these 6 months is now talking about a resolution that that actually they have spread a draft resolution, and in that draft resolution, the language that I see, whatever we see in the public view, it's very ambiguous, because the resolution it calls for it will be something along the lines that the United Nations Security Council determines the imperative of a ceasefire, immediate and sustained ceasefire, and then after that it talks about the ongoing negotiations, and it basically then supports that process of negotiation, rather than coming up with some binding resolution, or calling upon Israel very straightforwardly and unambiguously to stop this offensive. The language is not that. The language is primarily designed to support the process, the diplomacy that they are conducting, and I think that diplomacy, whether we like it or not, is the only hope now, because the pressure of all the countries in the world, whether they're Muslim countries, whether countries as far as Brazil or even the European countries, and now in recent days we know that many countries, for instance Canada, and there are some other European countries, they've banned the shipment of armaments to Israel, and Israel needs that, of course, from those countries, but more importantly the symbolic value of that. So I think it seems to me that there is now some hope that at least there could be a temporary ceasefire once this process of negotiation culminates, and that would alleviate the suffering of the people of Gaza, at least in terms of the resumption of humanitarian supply, medical care, food situation, and of course, with all this destruction, we can just imagine how many houses, how many homes have been destroyed, and they need some sort of fixing. So let's keep our fingers crossed. The last point I would make is that the Americans, the Secretary of State, who like you said, is on his 6th trip, and he has really been working on a very tight schedule. For the first time, he's talked about he talked about that just in passing before, but this time there seems to be some seriousness about that. That he's talked about the the peace process and the kind of the two-state solution and all because that is more important. Eventually, when this is resolved, I think for all the peoples in the world who want this situation to end, a temporary abeyance wouldn't do. What we all want to see is a permanent solution to this this conflict, and only that type of negotiations can bring it.
Right, you already mentioned a lot of points. Now, I would like to take one each separately. When we talk about there are tensions between the Democrats and the Republicans, there's been a voice by the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. Also, he criticized Israel Prime Minister. Let me quote him, that 5 months into this conflict, it's clear that Israelis need to take stock of the situation, ask, must we change course? At this critical juncture, I believe a new election is the only way to allow for a healthy and open decision-making process about the future of Israel. That clearly calls for replacement of Benjamin Netanyahu. Your understanding regarding that?
Yeah, this was a very interesting statement, because you see, nothing like that has happened in the U.S. History before, as far as we remember, because Chuck Schumer is the highest-ranking Jewish in the U.S. political setup right now. He's the Democrat. He's from the Democratic Party, of course, but the Senate Majority Leader, and he has been supporting Israel all his life. And they consider this this Jewish leadership in the U.S. They consider themselves the biggest supporters of Israel, and the frustration that he has expressed. There are 3 important points in that. Firstly, generally politicians, because they never get involved in the internal affairs, particularly politicians of, developed countries such as the U.S., in the internal affairs of other countries. So it's like a red line generally, and particularly for an ally, maybe for countries like, where they say, there's no democracy and this and that, they do that. But for countries, and particularly allies such as Israel, it hasn't really happened. So that was a red line he crossed. The second thing is, he criticized the conduct of course, what he has done in terms of, this offensive or anything, and that criticisms were very strong as well. And thirdly, when he was invited, because subsequently, Netanyahu, he addressed the Republican,
yes,
senators and congressional leaders, and he invited Chuck Schumer, and Chuck Schumer refused, And he refused on the ground that, he said that it had to be a bipartisan, no, you just don't address the Republicans, if you had, because it was not just because he was a Democrat, he is from the Democrat Party. His point of view was that, you're trying to, create a division within the U.S. in that way. And why did he say that? Because what we see now is the Republican Party is very strongly behind Israel, regardless of whatever has happened. And the public opinion also, because there were recently polls in the U.S. which said the people supporting the, who basically, are Republican Party's sympathizers who call themselves as Republican voters, a vast majority is still supporting Israel unconditionally, despite everything that has happened. On the other hand, those who support the Democrats, there's a clear division there. Of course, the Muslims and other ethnicities, but also the young, a lot of young people, a lot of young professionals, a lot of young students. They do not approve of what Israel is doing. So there's a division within the Democratic Party, which is not there within the Republican Party. And this could, this could really play out in the next election. And I think, and Netanyahu has been he's been manipulating, and he's been taking advantage of that, basically this weakness on part of the of the Democratic Party, because he knows that they are going into an election, and he knows that in this type of a situation, President Biden cannot afford, he's walking a very tight rope. He cannot afford to lose votes of the young and, of course, the different ethnicities. But even more so, he cannot afford to lose the vote of those who steadfastly support Israel, because they are more influential. Without their support, no president can be re-elected in the US or be elected for that matter, because that's a very, very strong lobby. So in this situation, Chuck Schumer's this kind of literally blast, it put Netanyahu on the defensive. But then, of course, he kind of and very interesting, the reaction within Israel was not very supportive of Chuck Schumer. For most part, even the opposition leaders, other than one or two exceptions, they said that why is Senator Schumer interfering in our domestic.
So what about President Biden saying that it was a good speech that Chuck Schumer made?
Yeah, I mean,
So what sort of an impact do you think it might have on his prospects in the election?
Well, I think President Biden is in a very difficult situation, because already, he's going to be the oldest presidential candidate who, of course, he's getting, is trying to be re-elected. But it has never happened in the U.S. history before. That is one thing. Secondly, although the U.S. economy is doing very well, and generally when the economy is doing well, presidents do get re-elected, but this is a very extraordinary situation because of his age, because of the fact that America is so polarized, because of the fact that, because what I see is that the young voters are shifting. A lot of young voters, a lot of Latin voters, a lot of black or African American voters who have traditionally supported the Democratic Party, they are shifting towards Trump. Now, on top of that, he's facing this problem where his party is getting some sort of a split because of what is happening in Gaza. And that is why I think the US administration is investing so much in this diplomacy that we see, this diplomacy by Secretary Blinken and others, because it is very important for them, not just because of the fact that there's so much global pressure and America right now seems to be standing alone in some ways, in having vetoed all those resolutions and still seeming to be just entirely supporting Israel in a situation which doesn't seem to be very defendable. But at the same time, it's the domestic constituency which is even more important, because he doesn't. So I think it will get very tricky for President Biden if there's not a ceasefire in the coming weeks or within a month.
Right, Mr. Saleem, as you have already mentioned, there is a lot of investments for as the diplomacy with the US is concerned that is being made right now. But looking at the statement by the Palestinian Foreign Ministry, which says that we appreciate Blinken's efforts, but we do not see any tangible results from his tours. This 6th tour since 7th of October. That speaks volumes. Of course, there's a lot of investment, a lot of stakes are involved as far as the Biden administration is concerned. But by looking at this particular statement, what do you understand of it?
Yeah, I mean, the statement has a point, but at the same time, these statements are kind of, it's posturing as well, because basically if you see different statements coming, because Israelis are coming up with very strong statements as well, and the Palestinian leadership would as well, because, this is from both sides, they have to balance the statements out. But the fact is, okay, this intense diplomacy, what has it done so far? First of all, I think very importantly, what it has accomplished is that this conflict did not spread, right? That was probably the first American priority, to stop this conflict from spreading. For example, Hezbollah did not get involved, other countries, and then they wanted to stop Iran from getting too involved in this. And I think for most part, that was accomplished. So it stayed sort of confined to Gaza. That was the first thing. Okay, the Houthi problem is there, in Yemen, but okay, but still, it was kind of still something which was marginal at best.
Haven't been there skirmishes as far as Hezbollah is concerned up in the north of Israel as well?
No, you see, those type of skirmishes is one thing, but a full-fledged attack from Hezbollah, because Hezbollah had the capacity to create a much bigger havoc than Hamas, because they have thousands of rockets and
So what has the US done in order to keep those countries not getting into the conflict. Is there any accomplishment on that particular front also?
Yeah, definitely. Basically because the first leg of the diplomacy was all about that. They're visiting all those capitals and putting, indirect pressure on Iran and sort of, and thus on Hezbollah and then, other countries in the region and getting them involved in the diplomacy and everything. And then, of course, the second leg was trying to sort of, restrain Israel. Okay, they didn't want them to stop the military action, but they wanted them to try to at least ensure that the civilian casualties were kind of within a limit which could be sort of.
What was the tolerable limit for the U.S.?
I mean,
is it even tolerable to talk about over 30,000 people already losing their lives?
Yeah, no, I'm not saying that is exactly what happened. I mean, that is where they failed, because the U.S. did not succeed in that. They were not able to restrain Israel, and the reason were multifold. Multiple reasons for that. First is that this was Netanyahu's political survival, and Netanyahu is very, very ruthless when it comes to his political survival. Then these type of politicians they don't really care.
If it's just about the political survival of Netanyahu himself, shouldn't there be any resentment as far as policy in this particular invasion is concerned domestically?
I mean, domestically there is resentment, and like Chuck Schumer said, it's not just Chuck Schumer. Chuck Schumer could not have spoken those words if he had not felt that there was within Israel a lot of resentment, which is there. The resentment is of sort of it's three-pronged. First of all, it's resentment that he could not, he was not able to prevent the 7th October action by Hamas. That was a big failure. The second one was that so far, despite all his claims and everything, Hamas is still there. Hamas is still fighting, right? And thirdly, the extreme right in Israel, they wanted drastic action whereby, for instance, Palestinians could have been displaced from there, and then they destroy the tunnel network and everything, and sort of or just kind of just reoccupy or what they wanted an extreme. He couldn't do that as well. So there's resentment within Israel, but not resentment in terms of the death toll. The resentment is actually unfortunately about what he's failed to accomplish despite all this death toll.
So isn't he already headed towards that particular direction when you specifically talk about completely displacing the population? Now when he talks about making a vow regarding going ahead with his assault on the southern city of Rafah in Gaza also, about which the US has also given a statement. They've repeatedly given the statements that it would be considered as a mistake. Now, hasn't he already gone into that direction?
Well, I mean, there was, of course, they carried out this operation in Al-Shifa hospital where they claimed that 90 Hamas, they call them terrorists, but they claimed that 90 Hamas soldiers were killed, but so far, a full-fledged action has not happened because of the repercussions. Perhaps to a slightly, to a lesser degree rather, perhaps the U.S. pressure as well, because the fact is that, as per their claims, if they wanted to destroy Hamas, that cannot happen, because this one concentration of 1.4 million people there, as per the Israeli claims, there's still thousands of Hamas operatives there, right? And also that tunnel network, that command and control sort of network that Hamas has, it is still largely intact, So the thing is, but the type of invasion that would be required, to kind of have a serious dent in that, that would lead to incalculable civilian civilian And so far, Israel has desisted from that. Now, they're thinking of different ways now. For example, one way is to this temporary displacement and everything. But I don't think it would be easy to do so. First, because of international pressure. Israel can disregard it generally. But for this particular aspect, international pressure is not about what countries are saying. It's also about what they're doing. For example, if the Egyptians don't accept anybody, which they have said they will not, or the countries don't, then where are they going to throw those 1.4 million people? Or where
That's exactly the point. And there are statements made by the U.S. authorities regarding the possible invasion of Rafah by Israeli regime. I'll take your detailed view regarding that, what could be the repercussions and how the US is going to go about that. For now, we are honored to have been joined by Brigadier Retired Jauhar Hassan, Senior Analyst, joining us on the phone line. Brigadier Hassan, thank you very much for your time, for being with us on the show tonight. Really appreciate that. Now, there are a number of developments as the situation in Gaza is unfolding. Specifically, I just can't possibly fathom the kind of severity and the kind of trauma that one has to accrue after such relentless and disproportionate bombardment all the time going on. So let's take a stock of the situation at the moment in almost 6 months of brutal aggression on the part of Israeli authorities against the innocent people in Gaza.
Thank you very much. I think, as we discussed last time, that this is part of the Dahiwa policy. And the Dahiwa policy is basically mowing the grass. And it is whenever there's a generation of Palestinians which is raised, grows up, or develops some infrastructure, Israel would come heavily and destroy it. But this time, since on 7th October 2023, Hamas then, because of frustration with Abraham Accord and so many other things that they were being sidelined, attacked Israel. So I think Israel then decided to basically go for a full-fledged, I would say, execution of the Dahiwa policy. And if you look at the start from North Gaza, then they pushed them towards Khan Yunis, the refugee camps, and now they're pushing them to Rafah. Basically, the old plan of it's kind of second, I would say, exodus of Palestinians being enforced, and they want to push it towards Egypt into the Sinai Desert. So that is the general policy. Although there's been brave fight by Palestinians and the resilience shown by people, even if you look at pictures of Ramadan, people observing fast in destroyed houses or cities. But I think Israel has been able to create that apathy to loss of life. Because as I remember, October, November, December, I think there was a lot of enthusiasm, coverage by most of the media internationally. And today you only find most probably Al Jazeera doing it. And by and large, everybody is now quiet and moving towards their normal life. And that's, I think, what Israel has been able to achieve is apathy to loss of Palestine. It's basically a genocide, not really loss of life. And we have discussed it umpteenth time that what has happened is a tragedy. I think the OIC or the Islamic world could have put their foot down through a number of means like diplomatic, economic, sanctions, and probably we could have avoided more loss of life. But let's hope this, I think, conference taking place now, and Blinken is in Egypt, and there are Arab foreign ministers also joining him, and I think one of the representatives from Palestine. And there is a hope that there will be ceasefire, because the atrocities now, has been seen by entire world, or the genocide online and live, it's almost daily telecast. But looking at how Israel has been able to, push the narrative and make it just a new normal, that is very, very tragic.
Right. So what's your understanding when we talk about the statements made by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer about the kind of policy Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has pursued? Let me bring his quote that it's clear that Israelis need to take stock of the situation and ask, must we change course at this critical juncture? I believe a new election is the only way to allow for a healthy and open decision-making process about the future of Israel.
Yeah, I think there have been, because the Jewish or the Zionist lobby in the U.S. is very, very strong, although there are senators and congressmen and politicians, and even President Biden has been trying to, motivate Israel. But at the same time, in the same breath, they would always, mention that Israel has all the right to defend itself. And just look at where the war has reached. So maybe there are a few people with conscience who try to pressurize. There are allies of Israel which are now pressurized, like Germany has been doing it. I think there were some voices from UK, but by and large, the West always says that ultimately it is Israel's right of self-defense, which is, I think, very, very obnoxious and very, very tragic. But looking at the current situation, because now this is a human tragedy which is unfolding and is going to be human catastrophe. It was expected that during Ramadan, at least, there will be some respite given to Palestinians, but that has not happened. There was also, as you are seeing on the screens, dropping the aid, and there was talk of making a bridgehead or a harbor that the U.S. would supply food and ration from basically sea. Tragedy is that the entire land is occupied, and now Palestinians in West Bank and Gaza are not being allowed their statehood, and Israel is actually doing whatever they want to do. But I feel that still there is time that in case, especially the Arab world and the bordering states like Egypt, Jordan, putting pressure, and then of course OIC backing it up, we could rescue whatever is left.
So how do you see the role that has been played by President Joe Biden so far? And now, according to White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, in 31 days they had the first phone call, Benjamin Netanyahu and President Joe Biden. Now, according to the statement Mr. Jake Sullivan has made, that the U.S. feels that a major ground operation in Rafah would be a mistake, and Mr. Biden warned Netanyahu against it. So, I mean, what makes the U.S. administration, when we specifically talk about the ground invasion on the part of Israelis into Rafah, that much important? Why the U.S. wants to hold the Israelis not to press ahead with this invasion in Rafah in particular?
Again, I think this is more of playing to the gallery, because there is an election coming up, and it is expected that Jewish lobby is going to put their foot down with finances. And either Trump or Biden both have to look at although there is a lot of vote of Muslim diaspora in U.S. which can affect, but by and large it is the Jewish or Zionist lobby's money which flows. But just on the ground offensive, I think last time we calculated the ordnance delivered was equal to 2 Hiroshima bombs, nuclear bombs, and now I think it is more than 4. The entire, I think, infrastructure has been raised to the ground, and people are literally living out in the open. They're stranded in camps, very close to Rafah. So I think talk of the ground offensive going in or not becomes immaterial, especially if you look at the destruction and the amount of, I think, effort that will be required to resettle them and rebuild the city. Just imagine what will happen. So I think Israel has been allowed by international community for this genocide, and maybe international community and OIC could have done better.
Right, Brigadier Hassan, now there is a proposal of a resolution at the United Nations Security Council as said by U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken that does call for an immediate ceasefire, but that is tied to the release of the hostages. And we hope that very much that countries will support that. How do you see this particular resolution being different from those resolutions which demanded for an immediate ceasefire, which were earlier vetoed by the U.S.?
Yeah, I think there is a change in this, at least in the international community or in the United Nations Security Council. Because earlier, all resolutions, whether they were pushed by, Western Bloc, Eastern Bloc, or Muslim countries, they were vetoed by the U.S. But now, U.S. is now coming himself forward and coming up with the resolution. But it is somewhat, made conditional, because trying to search for those hostages, I don't know how many are left, because there were, I think, figures given by Hamas that some of them have been actually killed by the Israeli bombing. But all told, there is, I think, positive change that now U.S. tabling resolution for a ceasefire, and hopefully, I think this further ground offensive should not go in, and there should be some. I think there was also talk of Qatar and the Israeli intelligence chief going and meeting some of the Hamas leadership. So maybe some solution is being sought. And still, I would say that whatever is left can be saved in case international community is serious about it.
Right, Brigadier Retired Jawad Saleem, Senior Analyst, joining us on the phone line. Thank you very much for being with us on the show tonight. We really appreciate that. Ambassador Saleem, when we talk about Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu again pledging to go with his ground invasion of Rafah in particular, with this particular statement that would be a mistake when White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan says, and Mr. Biden has warned Netanyahu against this particular ground invasion of Rafah. Why Rafah is so significant for the U.S., particularly the Biden administration? Why not other parts which already been invaded?
No, that part is, I think it's very simple to see in many ways, because it's not Rafah. It's the fact that 1.4 million Palestinians, that's the vast majority of population there, they moved to Rafah. So, and there's such a heavy concentration there. And Israelis, they've already sort of, okay, they have been sort of, they start from the north and literally combing, going along. They reach Khan Yunis in the south, and then now Rafah is the last point, because after that is Sinai basically. So the importance is those 1.4 million people. And the fact is, I think that the US is seriously concerned. Personally, I think it's not just playing to the gallery. It's basically the fact that President Biden knows that if there is a ground invasion, and the death toll already is 32,000, and of course that invasion could lead to a massive increase in death toll, and not just in death toll, but in terms of the the suffering, and in terms of the tragedy that the whole world will see there. And already they are at a point where they're losing support within the US, amongst their voters. They've lost support, a lot of support in terms of an international public opinion. And we have seen reports in media whereby in private conversations, leaks that have come, or media has, of course, they have their sources sometimes, that President Biden had privately criticized Netanyahu in much stronger terms than he has done so publicly. So that is why I think it's very serious for Biden, and it could really rock his chances of re-election. An operation like that, because already it's a very close contest between him and Trump, and if he loses, let's say even 5% or 10% of the of the votes in terms of the young voters or the Muslim votes, or or some of the other ethnicities which are more sympathetic towards Palestinians, or rather than the general US population, then it's kind of curtains for Biden's chances. And that is exactly why, I think he is very concerned.
So if he is very much concerned, but looking at this statement by Netanyahu, he says that we are going for it. At the same time says that it's not something we will be doing while keeping the population locked in a place. On the other hand, again, Jake Sullivan says that Israel hasn't provided US the plan of how and where that particular population of 1.4 million will actually go. And if Netanyahu presses ahead with the ground invasion and he actually launches it, so what about that frustration that you just already described? And multiple media reports suggest that President Biden has used very strong terms about Netanyahu earlier.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what the US wants to know, that what is the Israeli plan. And I think behind the scenes, discussions have taken place. Such discussions do take place, particularly amongst or between the intelligence agencies of the countries, as where they sometimes share their plans and say, okay, look, if you do that, this is what can happen and everything, because they do have a history of very close cooperation in all avenues, but particularly in intelligence. So they would want to know, the Americans, that how would Israel launch an operation and still keep the civilian casualties to, and that's, I use the term within, unfortunately you have to use the tolerable limits, tolerable limits for them is that, for example, there are certain red lines we all know that, in the last 70 years, there were many instances where countries were even tempted to use nukes, for example, right? And the nukes could have ended the wars, but it was never done. Okay, that's a very kind of a very clear red line, but there are also other red lines internationally. So
if the US, I see your pardon from the interjection over here, if that is the plan, for example, Netanyahu says that he has already said that this particular ground invasion is going to go hand in hand with enabling the civilian population to leave. Now, leaving to where? That is the most contentious question here in this particular situation. Does it also give an understanding that if he is going to allow the civilian population to leave, and when asked the question where to leave, so is that headed towards the Sinai? And if Netanyahu is able to present that plan up to the satisfaction of the Biden administration for letting that population leave and then carry out with that particular ground invasion, so does it actually lead that population completely out of the Gaza Strip once and for all?
I mean, it's not a question of leaving now because, they don't want to leave. The point is, if they can really just force them out, and that has to be done basically, by military means. And in that type of a scenario, we can just imagine the death toll. And also the Egyptians have made it very clear that they're not going to accept it. So I think that's hard to visualize. What is kind of more probable is, and that at this point in time, I think from sort of, it's more probable to see a situation where these negotiations for a temporary ceasefire, they succeed, because Israelis want all the hostages and perhaps eventually I think that might happen, all the hostages released. And that would sort of, that could bolster, Netanyahu's sort of, standing, to whatever little degree back home. Because I don't really see how they can just force this population by military means out of Gaza when there's nowhere to go, unless they ask them to go back to north, I mean, that could be one thing. But again, as we know, there's already 30 or 40% of the buildings destroyed. The whole civic amenities are not there. And in this type of situation, again, that could be catastrophic as well. So I think this could be posturing as well, by Israel, because you keep on doing that to put pressure on the other party to agree to their terms, and I think hostages are a very critical point in this whole sort of, scenario.
Right, one last very important point. This particular resolution proposed by the US, the UNSC, asking for an immediate ceasefire tied to the release of the hostages, as you have already mentioned, very critical point for them to be. Now, do you think this particular resolution is going to get the support from the rest of the Security Council? As you already mentioned, the language of it is ambiguous.
Yeah, I think it's, whatever language has come out, it's not just that it's ambiguous, but also the fact that it seems to be basically a resolution, which is, seemingly calling for a ceasefire, but in actual terms, it's a resolution, for, which basically is a call for supporting the peace process, the peace process, the behind-the-scene diplomacy, the negotiations that the Americans are conducting. So the resolution is more about that. So because the diplomats everywhere, and they're all experts, so they can see through that, of course, and while some countries might be amenable to agreeing, there would be many other countries who would say, well, this resolution doesn't really serve any great purpose, because it's not about asking Israel for a ceasefire, in terms of any binding means, or even sort of a clear resolution with a clear language on that. It's more about a resolution which is calling for supporting the peace process, or a resolution in support of the negotiations that the Americans are conducting.
So about those negotiations, one supplementary question out of it. Now, if there is a hope that has been expressed by Antony Blinken, saying that I think the things are narrowing and I think an agreement is very much possible. We also saw such an expression of hope earlier, just before the start of the month, holy month of Ramadan, by US President Joe Biden as well, that there is a possibility of a 6-week ceasefire deal. But again, he backtracked from that. So that particular hope that was earlier expressed by Joe Biden was not materialized, right? So what about this? Is this hope going to meet the same fate? Or are there any sort of chances that there could be a positive outcome later on?
I would keep my fingers crossed, because I think the whole world wants to see that, and the fact that Blinken is there on the ground, conducting negotiations, so he would be definitely more aware than what are the different positions and how close or how far they still are, and sort of what are the sticking points, and so if he has become more optimistic, then let's hope that something comes out of it.
Mr. Jauhar Saleem, former Foreign Secretary of Pakistan, joining us in the studio. Thank you very much for taking time out for Views on News tonight. Really appreciate that. With that, we come to the end of today's episode. Thank you very much for being with us.